Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to today's event on the role of development finance institutions in the early phase down of coal plants, hosted by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. My name is Rebecca Ray, Senior Academic Researcher at the GDP Center. Today's discussion is one of a series of webinars that we're hosting this spring. Join us on Tuesday, May 7th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time when we'll host Alexandros Kentelenis and Thomas Stubbs, authors of a new book, 1,000 Cuts, Social Policy in the Age of Austerity. And for those of you who are registered for the Civil Society Policy Forum of the World Bank and IMF spring meetings, you can join us on Friday, April 19th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for a panel on navigating the intertwined debt and climate crises, unveiling and assessing solutions. Information on both of these events is available at our website at www.bu.edu/GDP. Now, turning to today's topic. While many development finance institutions, or DFIs, have pledged to halt public finance into new coal-based power generation, they've yet to focus on supporting the decarbonization of existing coal plants. In fact, apart from some pilot initiatives, the direct engagement of DFIs on coal plant decarbonization has been limited. A new GDP Center report argues that DFIs are uniquely poised to play a key role in the early phase down of coal plants, given their distinct mandate to prioritize development and provide public goods. Furthermore, the authors argue that the ability of DFIs to supply concessional finance and tolerate high levels of risk makes them well equipped to play a role in phasing down coal-based power generation. So, how can DFIs best assist countries in transitioning away from coal-based power generation? What factors should guide the design of new phase-down initiatives, and how can DFIs help governments retire coal plants effectively and efficiently while ensuring a just energy transition and economic development? Today, I'll explore these questions with a distinguished panel of academics and practitioners. First, we're joined by Joan Miquel Carrillo, a blended finance lead investment officer in the Financial Products and Services Division at IDB Invest, the private sector arm of the Inter-American Development Bank. Joan Miquel joined IDB Invest in 2017, and since 2018 has acted as a focal point in the institution of the climate investment funds. Joan Miquel participates in the design of blended finance solutions across the region, with a focus on infrastructure and energy projects with a climate change mitigation or adaptation component. Joan Miquel has a Master's of Science in Civil Engineering from the Universitat Politécnica de Catalunya, Barcelona Tech in Spain, and has completed the Executive MBA of the ESAID Business School, also in Barcelona. Next, Tsitsi Musasike is a core faculty member of the Global China Initiative at the GDP Center and a professor of global development policy at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at at Boston University. At the GDP Center, she works on South-South cooperation, the role of development finance institutions in scaling up renewable energy in the Southern African Development Community region, and addressing project development challenges. She has over 20 years of cross-functional financial management and infrastructure financing experience in the private sector, private equity, consultancy, investment banking, and development finance environments. Next, we have Jackie Liu, a senior academic researcher with the Global China Initiative here at the GDP Center. He received his joint PhD in political science and environmental studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and a predoctoral fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. His research interests include the political economy of energy transitions and climate change, as well as the intersection of global governance and technology development. And finally, Nicolo Manic is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Global Economic Governance Initiative at the GDP Center. In his interdisciplinary dissertation at the Technical University of Berlin, or TUB, Nicolo examined the political economy of coal transitions. In parallel, Nicolo worked at the Mercator Research Institute, on Global Commons and Climate Change, or MCC Berlin. He holds an Master's of Science and Bachelor's of Science in Engineering and Management from TUB, specializing in energy and resource management. Now, before we open the discussion, I want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording is immediately accessible. And we encourage you to contribute your questions to the discussion. Please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom menu to ask questions. And when you do so, please also give your name and affiliation so our panelists know who they're speaking with. We'll take questions after our initial discussion, but please feel free to add your questions at any time. We'll first have Nicolo present on the key findings from our recent report. Following that, I'll have some questions for each of the panelists, and then we'll open to a broader Q&A. So Nicolo, over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. A warm welcome from my side. Let me share my slides with all of you. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I will provide a brief overview of the report, which was titled Early Phase Down of Coal Plants, the Role of Development Finance Institutions. It was based, or it is based, on a workshop that we organized in November last year with more than 30 participants, mostly researchers and practitioners. And then we published a report in March this year. And let me first give a brief overview of, I'm sorry, I'm having some issues here, of the motivation. So coal plant phase down can have a lot of benefits for countries, for instance, to reduce emissions, but also environmental and social benefits. But at the same time, if it is done in an unorderly fashion, it can have high risk, for instance, for energy insecurity. There can be job losses and slowed economic development. And that's where DFIs come in because, as Becky already mentioned, they are well poised to assist governments, for instance, because they tolerate high levels of risk, because they can provide concessional finance, and they have experience in energy sector and coal, as well as renewables. But thus far, there's only limited knowledge available. There are a few DFI-led initiatives, but most of them are at an early stage, so there's limited experience to draw from. That's why in this report, we explore the role that DFIs can play in coal plant phase down. And it is important to mention that DFIs should not only support early coal plant phase down, but that this should be part of a broader transition support. So this virtuous cycle by the World Bank explains that governments need targets, they need policies, they have to be capable institutions and a pipeline of bankable projects so that countries build more renewables. And renewables are needed in order to phase down coal plants. And DFIs can support governments, for instance, through transition preparation financing, strengthening networks and utilities, and so on. And one important aspect of this whole virtuous cycle is fossil fuel phase down financing. And especially here, the early retirement of coal plants, or the early phase down, to be more accurate. And what does it exactly mean, early coal plant phase down? Well, the term early basically means premature. So this is before reaching the envisaged lifespan without intervention. And this is based on, for instance, historical retirement ages, power sector plans, amortization of loans and debt and equity, but also power purchase agreements and coal supply agreements. And now when we talk about phase down, there are many options to decarbonize coal plants. So for instance, some of them include the continuous operation, for instance, co-firing, retrofitting, carbon capture and storage, so CSS. Others include to cease operation. Some keep the plant intact and keep them as reserve capacity, for instance. And others is really the retirement that many people talk about. So this can either be sole retirement, replacing plants with renewable capacity, or repurpose the site and the equipment. So basically build renewables on the side of the coal plant. And while the dismantling, so retirement, would yield the greatest, for instance, emission saving benefits, there are a couple of barriers that need to be taken into account. So here I only show a few of them. In the report, the list is much longer. And in the report, we categorize those barriers into 5 groups. The first one, internal DFIs policies, for instance, includes barriers like emission counting schemes of DFIs and coal exclusion policies, which could render support difficult. Other barriers are financial in nature, for instance, foregone profits and indebted governments and companies. This is, for instance, an issue in South Africa, which Tsitsi will talk about later. Then we have legal barriers, so power purchase agreement, coal supply agreements. We have socioeconomic barriers, energy insecurity, but also the risk for economic development, as mentioned earlier. And we have political barriers. So this implies, for instance, no political will to phase down coal plants or the reliance of state-owned enterprises on coal. And regardless of those barriers, a few FDIs have already engaged in early coal plant phase down initiatives. So for instance, the Accelerating Coal Transition, ACT by CIF, the Climate Investment Funds, which financially supports other initiatives like ADB's Energy Transition Mechanism. And the Energy Transition Mechanism now has the first pilot project in Indonesia. Then we have IDB Invest, who financed the replacement of a coal plant with a wind farm. And I'm super excited we have Juan Miquel here, who will talk about this later on. Then we have a World Bank initiative in South Africa, which aims at the repurposing of a coal plant using renewables and batteries. And so now the question is basically, how can DFI support the coal plant phase down in the future? And in the report, we identified 3 key areas. The first is about enabling environment. So here DFIs provide capacity to utilities, to government. They provide funding, for instance, for economic diversification and for retraining of workers, and also technical assistance. And this helps to overcome some key barriers like contractual obligations, but also just transition concerns. And 2 existing initiatives that do so are, for instance, the European Just Transition Mechanism and the JETPs. The JETPs, some of them also include financing on an asset level for coal plant phase down, but it's mostly provides an enabling environment. The second area is on banks' willingness. So here, the DFIs act as market shapers to incentivize engagement of other financial institutions. And the third one, which basically most of you are aware of, is then financing on an asset level. So here, the DFIs provide finance in de-risking instruments to, instance, overcome barriers like foregone profits and outstanding debt of utilities and plant operators, and also indebted governments and companies. And this is basically all the 4 initiatives that I mentioned on the previous slide. Even though the World Bank, EJP also mentions that this should basically act as to set precedents for other banks to follow suit. When DFIs engage in early coal plant phase down initiatives, it's important for them to consider a couple of factors. For instance, the feasibility. So this basically relies on the willingness of actors and also legal aspects like power purchase agreements. Then we have the climate impact. Here it's important to make sure that the emission mitigation is additional and permanent. Then we have financing, and here it's really key that DFIs provide concessional finance. And we have socioeconomic considerations. So here it's really so important that those transitions are just and that energy security is ensured. In addition to this, DFIs should also have some governance principles in place, for instance, that the transition is managed, as I mentioned earlier, because an unearly phase out would have a lot of risk. Then we have transparency and scalability so that their approaches can be replicated in other contexts. So to summarize, we have 6 major findings. First is that the phase down can take several forms, for instance, mothballing, retirement, repurposing, and so on. Second is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, but we need tailor-made solutions based on context-specific barriers. Next is that we need scalability, as explained on the previous slide. Fourth one is that it's important for DFIs to foster an enabling environment, for instance, through capacity building. The fifth is that DFIs are instrumental in financing on an asset level and that they have a lot of tools to do that. And the last one, as mentioned on the previous slide, that there are a lot of important considerations and prerequisites. And based on those findings, we then identified three main policy recommendations. The first one is, as mentioned on the previous slide, that the phase down of existing coal should be part of larger climate strategies to support governments. The second one is that DFIs should support an enabling environment and shape the market. And the last one is that it's really important that all DFIs initiatives are scalable and built around concessional and grant financing. And I'm sure that Tsitsi will pick up this point later on. And with this, I hand over to Becky. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolo, for that important context and background. Let's now move into the discussion. As a reminder for the audience, please feel free to contribute your questions in the Q&A box in your Zoom menu. For most people, that will be at the bottom of the screen. And when you do so, please remember to add your name and institutional affiliation so that our panelists know who they're addressing. Now, I'd like to start the discussion with a round of questions for all of our distinguished panelists. First, and I'd like to ask each of you, please, to keep your responses to 3 or 4 minutes in length to make sure we leave enough room for other panelists and for subsequent rounds of questions. I'd like to start by directing a question to Tsitsi, and that is simply, in your view, how can DFIs best support coal phase down in the Southern African region? Thank you. Please go ahead, Tsitsi.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. South Africa is a great case study as it has recently gone through the Komati coal power plant decommissioning. Firstly, the country adopted a decommissioning, repowering, repurposing approach as opposed to a simple decommissioning and repowering approach. And this was done on Eskom's balance sheet. So this has got implications on the indebtedness of the utility. But again, the country has also learned a lot of lessons, from the Komati project. Significant financial resources are required for decommissioning, repowering, and repurposing, right? The Presidential Commission on Climate Change has recommended recently that the decommissioning component be funded by the utility, and that repurposing and repowering be funded by the private sector. That is your DFIs, your commercial banks. So repurposing and repowering are commercially viable, aspects, meaning that they could be done or they should be done on a project finance or P basis. So to answer your question, Rebecca, and given the fact that we are talking climate change, a challenge of the commons, DFIs should consider the following: providing more concessional loans and than commercial loans. We know that on Komati, 90% of the funding was on commercial terms, right? We spoke about repurposing and repowering being done on a commercial standalone or project finance basis. This opens up opportunities for the DFIs to play a project development role or a program development role, which means that, repowering, decommissioning, and repurposing could be done on a programmatic basis, which allows for scalability. The DFIs should also consider providing longer tenors and longer grace periods, for these transactions. DFIs should also consider crowding in the private sector, given the scale of the funding requirement and given the fact that we now are looking at a programmatic approach. we know that commercial banks were notably absent on the Komati project. DFIs should also consider providing support to transformation partners and local communities to facilitate their participation in the ownership of these repurposed or repurposed projects. We know DFIs are also best positioned to fund the local community's participation at the shareholder level in project finance or PPP structures, given their experience on the REAP program. This would address some of the concerns around local communities being left behind. And one of the criticisms is that the DFIs are slow in their investment approval processes. Therefore, they should be able, they should ensure that they are able to move quickly to ensure replacement of displaced jobs. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Cici. Now I'll turn to Jiaqi. In your view, Jiaqi, how can Chinese DFIs in particular support governments' efforts around the world to implement coal phase down? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. I think from the Chinese perspective, like this idea of early coal phase down is actually consistent with the principle of the BRI International Development Coalitions. And these Chinese DFIs could implement these like green development ideas by establishing investment standards that target energy system-wide emission reductions. And there are a lot of technology and infrastructure options here to help early phase down. So based on like this past coal phase out experience, especially in the US and Europe, like coal power plants could be shutting down much faster with the right market pressure. Like today, these renewables are becoming increasingly competitive, even without government subsidies in many parts of the world, including in China. So this can happen in the developing world as the DFIs continue to invest in renewable and continue to invest in the electricity grid. And here, I think investment in the grid system is very important because this coal phase down process could be much more stable with the right design of the electricity system. Like previously, Chinese DFIs have experienced by partnering with Chinese SOEs, such as the state grids, to invest in the grid stability and transmission distribution system in developing countries. So in the future, I can see like these DFIs continue to work with the grid companies and invest in strengthen the electricity grid, reduce the need for base load from coal power plants, and invest in energy storage that can reduce this renewable intermittency. So that's therefore and creates room for early phase out of coal power plants. Also, these DFIs can help build, like these developing countries to build domestic government capacity that allow the recipient governments to become more self-sustainable with the right design of electricity market and incentives for renewable and grid expansions. I will leave it here.
Thank you, Jiaqi. And now I'll turn to João-Miquel, who with IDB Invest, which was, of course, highlighted in Nicolo's presentation as doing some of the most cutting-edge work in this field. So, João-Miquel, in your view, where has IDB Invest best made use of its resources to support coal phase down?
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. First of all, thanks for having me. Also, congratulations for the paper. It's very, very well put, very well structured, and also helps practitioners to make our mind when we're dealing with this problem. Second thing I wanted to acknowledge is that coal transition is probably one of the most complex developmental challenges that I have faced in my career, and there's several layers of complexity that are intertwined, and it's fascinating, but at the same time very challenging. Just 3 ideas on what can we what have we done as DFI and what can we do in the future too. So first thing is that for any type of energy transition, and more specifically for coal transition, there's a need of, let's say, public-private cooperation, or at least common understanding. And that's something that is an enabling condition for that transition to happen. You cannot start, and just let me clarify, I work for the private sector arm of IDB. So, I mean, we only talk with private sector companies, but we need to find something already established when we start this type of conversation. So here, you know, the role of public sector is to establish the framework for the transition in the sort of way that any country may have a strategy, a plan, a public-private dialogue, whatever it is the way that they find, but there needs to be a common understanding of what's going on in the energy sector in the future for that country. Second is the public sector is the one that needs to ensure the resiliency of the system through this transition. I mean, there's certain investments, certain areas of attention that have to be there before any type of decommissioning of baseload power and some sort of ancillary services is done in the system. And the third one is that the public sector is the one that leads the social aspects of this transition, which are crucial for the whole transition. And there's no way out without taking that into account from the beginning. That's the first thing. The second thing is that at the end of the day, this is an issue of allocating a subsidy. So you have mentioned that in your paper. There's a need to incentivize behavior, which is more complex. I mean, it's one of the most complex issues is because we are incentivizing someone for not doing something, where it is much easier to incentivize someone to do something without taking them out of any type of other type of business, resources, etc. So that's a conversation that is much more complicated. So, but anyways, if we go back to the basics, we need to provide a subsidy against an incremental impact. That means for us in that issue, this is acceleration. So what we want is to provide subsidy so these things happen faster. They will probably fast anyways. There's a baseline where these things will not be competitive in the market at some point in time. But here the issue is that we are talking about time, and in energy transition, time is of the essence. So we want an additional income that is an additional impact that is maximized, which is time, is acceleration. And second, we want to do that at the least cost possible for the contributors, for the public. So that means that we need to address how the system can become more resilient and more sustainable after the transition. That means that we have to think about the replacement of that energy, and that replacement needs to be more competitive, more productive than the one that we are leaving behind. Because the outcome of this is to achieve, shift one pathway of growth, which is the one that we have had for centuries on fossil fuels, to another that is sustainable and inclusive. So that's the outcome that we want to achieve by managing that subsidy. The paper is very clear. There's three ways of putting that. I mean, there's no other way around. Or whether we provide subsidized debt or subsidized equity or concessional equity, or we find an additional source of income for these assets to be incentivized to accelerate the retirement. So what we are doing in IDB Invest is that we are looking at ways to incorporate an additional income for coal power owners in order to accelerate in a certain way their retirement. Three important things on that is that for that to happen, we need to put together a methodology to account for that additional income. For that, what we are using is coal transition carbon credits for that ensures quality and integrity of that asset. So there needs to be an assurance of additionality, permanence, no leakage, etc., embedded in a methodology that we designed for the case of Chile. Second is that this additional income needs to be a flexible tool that commensurates the subsidy with the output. So we need coal transitions need flexibility. So that means that we will subsidize as long as these things are happening, and only as long to the extent that these things are happening. So this kind of mechanisms allows us to really adjust the amount of subsidy to the actual output that we are trying to attract. And the third one, which is also very important, and that's a role of the DFIs, is that creating a new type of asset that can be a tool for attracting private institutional capital to that transition. If we are able to create a type of co-transition carbon credit that ensures high quality and high integrity, that may be attractive. So private investment can flow to this asset and subsidy can be minimized, and by consequence, we are more efficient in our intervention. We can expand faster this type of intervention. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Jean-Michel. Next, I'd like to ask each of you to consider the same question for the next round because it's so important. I'd like each of your 4 perspectives on it, please. And that is, how can we ensure that coal phase downs are just and equitable? What does that phrase mean to you in your studies, in your practicing, in your practice? And what kind of strategies can we adopt to further that goal in your line of work? Thank you very much. And again, please, we're aiming to keep answers in the 3 to 4 minute range, just to make sure we have time for the Q&A after. Why don't we do it in the same order we did before, just for practicality? So we'll start with Nicolo this time, and then go through the panelists in the same order, just for ease.
Sure. I didn't expect that you would ask me this question. I'm sure I have some answers to that. I guess what is important here is that we look at different levels. So when we talk about just and equitable, it should be on a country level. So because some countries are worse off than others. So it's important to, for instance, ensure the economic development on a country level. It's important to look into communities. And here communities, I guess what is important that some communities are, for instance, built around coal plants and a lot of their income is derived from coal plants. And then also on the individual person level. So we have the workers working in the coal facilities. We also have, of course, electricity consumers because coal plants can lead to higher electricity costs. So all this has to be considered. And I guess what Jean-Michel mentioned is it's really important, especially of the private sector, to make sure that this is all so like that those safeguards are in place before coal plants are retired. So this is why when we talk about this enabling environment, for instance, that DFIs, for instance, engage in diversification of economies, engage in retraining of workers basically before a coal plant is retired. So this approach basically then also creates more support in the population. And I guess this is a key here because we don't want people, I guess in South Africa, this is a big issue that you retire coal plant first and then people lose their jobs and they're super frustrated with the transition and so on. So you first want to basically create the enabling environment and get the support of people on board and also listen to people and communities' opinion. And basically only then afterwards, then phase down the coal plants. So this would be my reply here.
Thank you. On to you, Tsitsi.
Thanks, Rebecca. For me, it means consultation very, very early in the process. The utility already knows and government already knows when these plants are going to be decommissioned and repurposed. Therefore, early engagement is key. And in transparency, Nicola has already touched on that. And I think to me, it really means following through on the stakeholder engagements. If you have engaged with the communities, you need to ensure that your actions are aligned, with the conversations that happen, at these engagement processes. And also ensure alignment, between the various ministries. Politicians tend to contradict each other, especially when you're talking about, coal phase down. So we need to make sure that, the speeches, the government speeches are aligned with the engagements that are happening on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tsitsi. And Jachi.
Thank you, Becky. I think just from my justice perspective, like there are 3 levels of justice. One is for me is at the international level. the international community should continue to support the developing countries to allow with the right financial and institutional resource that allows them to close down these coal power plants earlier. And at the domestic levels, there are international efforts to help these governments to build government capacities that create those kind of enabling environments that Nicola just mentioned. I think from that perspective, there are many NGOs around the world, especially those from the US and Europe, can help to smooth the process. Not only these domestic governments can help, but these international communities should be there to support the co-workers and the communities there in these countries to build up support for individuals. And the last perspective is a political perspective. There should be political justice for workers and the workforce that relates to the coal industry, as well as their investors. Investors are looking for early engaging in this investment in coal power plant. They are looking for the right payoff, right? They are looking for the right compensations, and this should not be missed. And so in the future, investors will continue to have this confidence in this market and continue to invest in energy, especially the renewable energy sectors. Right. Thank you. I will leave it there.
Thank you, Andrew and Mikel.
Yes, thank you very much. Just to knowledge, this is not my main area of expertise. And also another point that is important, in my experience, I've not been involved in transitions that involve mining. And I believe that these transitions are quite a different and more complex issue to tackle. But I have three ideas that I can share from my experience. The first one is what's the perimeter of the intervention from that social transition perspective. So for us, it needs to encompass direct jobs from the power plant, needs to include subcontracted jobs from the power plant, and needs to take into account indirect jobs, which is extending the perimeter to the for which we are looking at the issue. The second thing that I would say is that it's really important to plan ahead before that the actual decommissioning is going to happen. So you need to have some space in order to prepare the local economy, the impacted economy for that transition. And also it's important to mention two ideas. One is that coal transition calls for gradualism. That's really important. I mean, you have to take step-by-step approach and be sure that every time that you take a decision, there's a strong foundation to take that decision in terms of the enabling environment supporting that decision. So that's one thing. And the second is flexibility. Flexibility is important in this process. You need to have some buffer space. So if some enabling conditions are not there yet, so you can just stop. You can just wait a little bit more and do the steps when you are ready. And the third thing, which is more like from a financial perspective, and that's something we are trying to design here for the Dominican Republic, is that we can embed just transition components in the additional income instruments that we are trying to create. That means that we can design a share of proceeds by which the additional income that is received from international investors in order to acquire those type of carbon assets can have a share of proceeds that is dedicated to just transition components that can be derived to the local communities, to the public, to the government, to the local governments, etc. So you can define some sort of a certain sustainable income that will support during the process this transition. So these are the three ideas I wanted to share.
Thank you. I have a round of questions now from the audience. Thank you so much to those who have contributed questions. And as a reminder, if you have a question and you haven't contributed it yet, please feel free to do so through the Q&A box in your Zoom menu, which for most people is at the bottom of your screen. I'd actually like to take these in a different order, if that's okay with the panelists. I'd like to start with the practitioners when we respond to these questions. So, João Miguel, I'll ask you to start, if you don't mind my putting you on the spot, followed by Tsitsi and Jachi, and then Nicolo, if you have anything to add. The three questions are: Max Schmidt from Perspective Climate Research says, your fantastic report is coal-centered, but to what extent are its findings applicable to other fossil fuels, particularly LNG? Considering the flood that we've seen recently, not just of gas power, but also highly specialized infrastructure such as LNG vessels, liquefaction, and regasification units. We have a question from Tarela Moses, a database manager and data analyst here at the GDP Center, who asks, could any of you give an example from your region of focus of how the private sector has partnered with DFIs to achieve decommissioning, repurposing, or repowering? We'd love to hear some more about the important role of the private sector here. I believe it's been mentioned a lot as a really core partner in this project, but we'd love to have a little more depth there. And what were some lessons learned that should inform how the private sector can play this role in the future? Excuse me. And from Vishal Manve, we have, how do we use coal retirement mechanisms when there exists strong opposition on the political front from those in some emerging economies, which have been traditionally highly reliant on coal to power their economies? So those are three questions with different approaches, one about the private sector, one about the applicability to gas, and one about sometimes a lack of political motivation or political will to tackle such a powerful sector. João Miguel, would you mind getting us started here? Thank you.
Sorry, what do you want me to go through the 4 questions or?
Whichever you would like to start with. If there's anything in particular that jumps out at you that you think this is really core to my experience and expertise. For example, as you work so closely with private sector actors, you might choose to take that question first. And if you have anything else to add about the others, please feel free to do so. So for all of our panelists, please feel free to answer the question that you think is the most relevant to your area of expertise. And if I find at the end that no one has addressed one in particular, I may put one of you on the spot to focus on it. Thank you.
Yes, I can start with the question from Tarela and just refer to our experience in Chile. So I would go back again to one of the points I made before, which is, the enabling environment. So in that case, one of the elements of the enabling environment was that the government has set up a clear goal for retirement of this coal power plants at 2040. That was a goal established, defined by the government, completely public, and from there, they established a roundtable with the private sector, where they start discussing, okay, how can we make that in an orderly fashion? And the private sector companies in Chile involved in that were like big international companies with their own decarbonization goals. So that helped the conversation. So what is important here is that both the government and the private operators had a very clear understanding of what was going on, and they have a common view of what should happen in the future. So that was a huge condition, a huge enabling condition in order to come later with financing to accelerate that process that was already starting. So that makes things really much easier. So having a counterparty that is committed to decarbonization, that it's important. But I believe that public-private dialogue is key and instrumental before any pure financial intervention can occur.
Thank you. That's especially relevant in the case of Chile. I'd like to turn to Tsitsi and ask about your experience in the Southern African Development Community region with regard to any of these questions, whether it's the role of the private sector or some political opposition to tackling coal phase down or the rise of natural gas. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. No specific experience regarding private sector privatization. Private sector participation in coal phase down. I know that the Presidential Commission on Climate Change has already hinted that there is a role for private sector to participate in coal phase down, specifically looking at the repurposing and repowering or refiring components. So definitely a role there regarding private sector participation because of the scale of the funding that is required. If you're looking at ESCOM alone, approximately 8 more power stations need to be decommissioned because they've reached the end of their useful life. So that is a significant role for private sector, to play in terms of repurposing and repowering. Thanks, Rebecca. In terms of the second question around LNG, no specific experience with that sector. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jackie, do you have anything to add from your academic experience in general or regarding China in particular?
Yeah, first I want to pick up on the LNG perspective, the case. I think in the future, as don't forget there are hydrogen as well. So with continuing investment in hydrogen, these LNG facilities and pipelines can be converted into liquefied hydrogen or other type of hydrogen products, and contributes to green transitions. And from the political perspective about the last question about the political pushback from established coal interests, I think that is a continuing challenge for many developing countries, especially Indonesia, Malaysia, and other part of Southeast Asia, those fast developing countries. I think, but political environment can change, right? In the next 15 to 20 years, I have no reason to believe that the current established interests can stay as strong as is today, with the right combination of the market change and international pressure. And we will continue to monitor that in the future. And at GDP Center, we will look into the political perspective of this kind of energy transition as well. So stay tuned to our future.
Thank you for that. We have time for another round of questions, and this time I'll get a little more specialized with who the questions are directed to. So, João-Miguel, you mentioned specifically, I believe you mentioned some about the role and potential utility of carbon markets or carbon credits and other financing innovations. And I'd love to hear a little more from you about how to best use some of those emerging financial instruments and emerging tools at our disposal to be able to make projects feasible financially, as well as all of the other things from an engineering and political perspective. Tsitsi, you mentioned some about repurposing, and I'd love to hear some examples from you that you may have, or how might policymakers and DFIs consider the options of repurposing or mothballing or retiring altogether. How can policymakers and DFIs approach that question? For the academics on the panel, I'd like to, this report certainly makes steps towards filling the gaps that still exist in developing and compiling public knowledge in the space in order to be able to support action. I'd like to ask you, what gaps do you think maybe still exist in public knowledge? How can we best as academics, how can we best continue to work in filling the gaps in the public knowledge and getting emerging public knowledge like this report into the hands of practitioners to be as supportive as possible? So that's kind of one targeted question for each of you. And then I have a general question that is for the whole group. contributed in the Q&A box by Tim Herschel-Burns from the BU GDP Center, who asks about concessional finance. While reforms to the international financial architecture are needed to expand the availability of low-cost financing, right now, concessional financing is fairly limited. So what aspects of coal phase down most require concessional finance or other kinds of creative mechanisms, and when can finance on commercial terms suffice? So that's a question for each of you, in addition to the targeted questions that I've asked each of you. And again, I'd like to go in the order of practitioners first here, if that's okay. To start with Jean-Michel.
Thank you very much. Let me address Tim's question first. It's important to acknowledge that concessionality, subsidy, is a spectrum. So there's different, let's say, different shades of concessionality. There's what we do at Blended Finance, private sector, IDB Invest, is that we manage donor resources that are like, let's say, hard concessionality, subsidies that we can allocate in our transactions. However, MDBs themselves, or DFIs themselves, can be more bold in the use of their own balance sheet. So that's what is happening as we speak. So mostly all MDBs, and specifically IDB Invest, is going through processes to maximize the capacity of their balance sheet in order to increase the risk tolerance. And increasing risk tolerance for the same amount of return, that's some sort of subsidy. We can call it self-subsidy. So there's a combination of, let's say, tools that we have available. The one that I'm working right now in the Dominican Republic with this climate investment funds, acceleration coal transition resources. This is $2 billion that are available or have been endorsed to several countries. And that's, let's say, hard concessionality. But also the MDBs can provide a financing that allows the transition to happen. However, what I want to mention is that for this transition, that you have to combine the decommissioning of a coal asset with the replacement with a clean asset. So as of now, in the majority of the countries of my region, so there's availability of commercial finance to finance the replacement asset. So we have to focus, we have to be very precise when we focus concessionality in incentivizing the coal power plant owner to shut down earlier. So that's the laser focus that I think we need to use subsidy to target. So that was that question from Tim. And the other one was on the use of carbon credits. Well, I will be really, really fast. So the idea, again, is to generate a source of additional income. We are this is something that we are working as we speak. It's an innovation. So it's like, it's an idea that we believe that as an outcome may provide the most efficient use of concessional resources. That means if we can provide some sort of price affirmation, some sort of security, kind of carbon insurance or guarantee of pricing for the coal power plant owners to make the decisions, then down the road, if those assets are created with high quality and integrity parameters, can generate an inflow that may just wipe out all the subsidy that we are using, and we can recycle that to the next iteration. So that's the approach, and that's one of the key reasons why we are thinking that this type of asset can be useful in this transition.
Wonderful, thank you. Tsitsi.
Thanks, Rebecca. In terms of concessionality, if I'm looking at South Africa's case, right, and the migration from a utility balance sheet funding for phase down to a project finance or PPP structure for the repurposing and repowering, then it means that the project will benefit through concessional funding from a lower tariff, right? And which means that we are addressing SDG 7, clean, affordable energy, by reducing, the tariff, and the power becomes, affordable for the local communities and for the poor and the vulnerable. So for me, the concessionality should apply on the repurposing and repowering, and not on the decommissioning. Presumably, the utility would have set aside funding for decommissioning because this is something that is part and parcel of the of the power plant when it is first installed. So setting aside a fund for decommissioning is a requirement, and that funding should still be available on the utilities balance sheet. And therefore, the concessionality would not apply on decommissioning, right? If we're looking at the other issues around, sure. Sorry, remind me again, Rebecca. I've forgotten the other issue.
I said repurposing versus decommissioning,
Yeah,
making those decisions. And you've already addressed some that
Yes.
concessionality is particularly useful for repurposing. But if there's anything else you'd like to add about
Yeah.
that choice and strategy.
Yeah, that's already addressed. Well, it is decommissioning is part and parcel of the new power plant when it is when it is commissioned, right? There is no project that should happen without a decommissioning plan. Every project should have a decommissioning and repurposing plan towards the end of the life of the plant. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Jiaqi.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Becky. I think to add on Titi's perspective, I think the commission plan plus some standards for decarbonizing the grid system is important here. And in the future, I can definitely see the other DFIs joining the teams for decarbonizing the electricity grid and making more investments into the electricity grids and energy storage system that enable a more renewable penetrations and slightly reduce the base loads for coal and other type of fossil fuels. And with that, I think I will stop here. I will pass it to others.
Okay, Nicolo.
Yeah, sure. So about the question on like what knowledge gaps still exist, I think what would be great is to engage in like what Cici mentioned, stakeholder engagement. So what do the people on the ground really need? What do individuals really need? What do communities really need? I guess this has been done so far mostly for coal mines, but it would be great to have that for coal plants as well. So really know like how can we convince people that it's a good thing. And I just wanted to add on the question earlier about like the opposition from policies. I guess actually at this point, I mean, even Indonesia and South Africa, that are both countries that highly rely on coal, they both have in their ZPs coal plant phase down. So I think like most of the countries actually around the globe are aware that coal plants need to be phased down rather sooner than later. So I guess this political opposition should hopefully not be such an issue in the future.
Thank you, Nicolo, and a sincere thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your thoughts with us today, and thank you to all of those who participated in this discussion. This talk has been recorded on YouTube, and we'll share the link to that YouTube video in the chat now. We hope you'll join us for upcoming webinars later this spring. On Tuesday, May 7th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll have a book talk with Alexandros Kantikelenis and Thomas Stubbs, who are the authors of a new book, 1,000 Cuts, Social Policy in the Age of Austerity. And for those of you who are registered for the Civil Society Policy Forum of the World Bank and IMF Spring Meetings, you can join us on Friday, April 19th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for a panel on navigating the intertwined debt and climate crises, unveiling and assessing solutions. To receive updates for these events and for other publications, you can subscribe to receive updates from our Global Economic Governance Initiative at www.bu.edu/GDP, and that link will also be put in the chat. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today, and we'll see you next time.